In this video, we'll start looking at Java looping, and we'll start with the first available tool for looping or repeating instructions, which is the while loop. So we'll start with defining what is looping, what do we mean by looping, whether in Java or any other programming language. We'll look at the while loop syntax, which is the first type of looping operations we'll look at in this chapter. We'll look at the flow of control of while loops. We'll discuss some of the terms associated with looping, and we'll see the steps that we need to follow to create a loop in Java, whether it's a while loop or other types of loops. And lastly, we'll look at the problem of an infinite loop and how we can avoid that problem in our programs. Looping is basically repeating. We have an operation or some actions that we want to perform more than once, so we want to repeat that operation more than once. How many times we want to repeat that operation? Sometimes we know that number, so we know that we want to repeat that operation for 5 times, 6 times, or whatever number of times. Or sometimes we want to keep repeating the operation until we have a condition that is being met. So for example, we want to keep reading input from the user until they are done. So they will say that we are done, and that's when we stop repeating that read operation. We'll be looking at 3 different looping operations in Java. And in this video, we are going to focus on the while loop. We also have a do while loop, and we also have the for loop, which we'll look at in different videos. Our while loop has a syntax similar to the if statement. So we have the keyword while, followed by a Boolean expression inside these parentheses. And then in these brackets or curly braces, we have the statements that will be executed. These statements will be executed if this Boolean expression is true. Now, the difference between a while and an if statement, in the if statement, we only executed these statements if the condition was true once. In the while loop, we keep executing these statements until the Boolean expression becomes false. So the first time we check that expression, we'll execute these statements, and then we'll go back and check the expression again. If the expression is still evaluating to true, we'll go again and execute the same statements again. So if you look at our flow of control, we have some statements. We are initializing variables, and then we are evaluating the condition. If the condition is true, same with the if statement, we'll execute that loop body. Then we will go back and evaluate the condition again. After we are done with that loop body, we'll go back and evaluate the condition again. As long as the condition is evaluating to true, we'll go back and execute the loop body and then check the expression again. Once that expression evaluates to false, we'll not execute that loop body and we'll continue with our program. So the loop body, we will execute it multiple times depending on the condition that we have here. If the condition is still evaluating to true, we'll go back to the loop body and execute whatever is in there again. So let's look at an example here in Eclipse to make things a little bit clearer. Let's say that I want to print all the numbers from 1 to 10. Now to print, we can use the system.out.println to print the first number, which is in our case number 1. Now I will need another print statement to print number 2. So I can copy and paste this, for example, and I will print number 2. I will need another print statement for number 3. Now notice every time I'm printing or I'm copying this operation, I'm changing the number in here. Now what I can do is I can start with an integer num, and we can start by storing the value 1 inside it. And the first print operation, I can print that num, and then after that print statement, I can increment the number by 1. So num++ will be incrementing the num value. So we printed 1, and then we incremented the value by 1, so we have 2. So I can actually now copy, and without making any changes to my syntax in here, I'm not changing anything inside my print line. I'm just copying and pasting the same operation. So I'm printing the number and then incrementing the number. Printing the number after we incremented it, and we print it again. Notice if I want to print the 10 numbers that I have, or the from 1 to 10, I will need 10 statements or 10 of these 2 operations. So printing the number and then incrementing it by 1. So my code will be very long when we have these statements. So 2 statements, 10 times, that will be about 20 statements. What if we needed to print the numbers from 1 to 100 or 1 to 1,000? My code will be very, very long in that case. Now, since I'm repeating the operation over and over again, we call that looping. So I can utilize one of the looping techniques, which we learned about so far, which is the while loop, to repeat that operation over and over again. So to use a while loop, the operation that I want to repeat will be in my while loop body. So I can surround it by these curly braces. These are the operations I'm repeating, which are printing and then incrementing the number after we print it. And then I will have a condition here that we check to make sure that we are not exceeding the value that we want to go to. So while my number is less than or equal to 10, I want to print that number. So we started with number 1. 1 is less than or equal to 10, so we'll be printing that number and then incrementing that number by 1. So my new number will be now 2. Is 2 less than 10? So once we are done with the loop body, we need to check back the condition. Is 2 less than or equal to 10? It is, so we'll go back and print that number and then increment it. So every time we are done with the loop body, we'll go back and check that condition until that condition is becoming false. Once that condition becomes false, we will stop executing that loop body and we'll go to whatever statement we have after that. So let's save this and run it and see what happens. And you will see that we are printing all the numbers from 1 to 10. So in our example, we wanted to print all the numbers from 1 to 10. The operation that we were repeating is the print operation. And we started before the loop by creating a variable, an integer variable that has 1 stored in it. And that's what we called initializing our variables. So this is the variable we'll be using in our loop. So we initialize that variable before the loop. And again, we wanted to print that number that we stored in that integer. And after the print operation, we wanted to increment it by 1. So the operation that we are repeating actually is not only the print operation, it's also incrementing that variable. And that's why we included both these operations in our loop body. Now the condition, since we are going from 1 to 10, the maximum we can get to is 10. So while my number is less than or equal to 10, we'll be printing that number and then incremented it again by 1. Now we needed to have the equal with that less than because we want to include 10. If we did not put equal with that less than, we're only going to print from 1 to 9 because 10 is not included in that condition. So let's go over some of the terms that we use with looping. Every time we execute the loop body, we'll call that an iteration. So once you execute that loop body, this is called one iteration of that loop. A loop update is basically one statement or more that will cause or could cause the loop condition to evaluate to false. So we are updating the variable that is in the loop condition, and by updating that variable, eventually it will evaluate to false. So the loop update or the loop update statement or statements, these are the statements that could cause the loop condition to evaluate to false, and this means ending the loop execution. The loop termination condition is the event that will cause that loop condition to evaluate to false and make that loop terminate. So it's really important that we have the loop condition evaluate to a false at one point. If the loop condition never evaluates to false, the loop body will keep executing continuously without an end. And that's what we call an endless loop or an infinite loop. So my loop condition has to evaluate to false at one point. Otherwise, our program will keep running the same operations or the same statements forever without an end. So let's go back to our example and try that. Let's say that we are never updating the value of num. So let's delete this line. So we started with num equals to 1. 1 is less than or equal to 10. And we printed num, which is equal to 1. So we printed 1. We are not updating the value of num. So we are going back and checking, is num less than or equal to 10? Num is still equal to 1. And 1 is less than or equal to 10. So we'll go and print 1 again. And we'll keep repeating that operation. And there's no end to that operation because the condition is always evaluating to true. So if we run this, you'll see that my program is printing 1 endlessly. It will keep printing 1 without an end until we click on the terminate button here. So how can we tell if we have an infinite loop? If we didn't have in our loop body a statement that prints out an output, the computer will appear to be hanging. So there's nothing happening in our computer. If the loop body produces output, so we are printing out something to the user like we had in that example, the output is repeatedly written without an end, like we saw. We kept typing out number 1 to the console. So how can we stop an infinite loop? We can just abort the program or terminate it like we did in that example. So usually your loop body will have an update statement, which is updating the loop condition. So we are updating the num value, we are incrementing that value. And by updating that loop condition, at some point, eventually this will cause the loop condition to evaluate to false, which means terminating that loop. So it's really important that inside your loop, you will be updating the loop condition at some point. So the loop condition will at some point be changing, and eventually it will be changing or making that condition evaluate to false. So whether you are updating it directly in your loop or you are reading an input from the user where the user will be entering that termination condition. So let's say instead of printing out the numbers from 1 to 10, I want to print from 10 to 1. So I can start by having my initial value as 10, and then after printing that number 10, we want to decrement the value of numbers, so num minus minus. So we started with 10, we printed 10, we decremented, and then the next time we'll be printing 9. Now we'll see the problem we have here when we run this program. You'll see I'm printing the numbers. I started with 10, but then I got into an infinite loop. I'm printing all the negative numbers without a stop. So I will terminate this program and see where the problem happened. Notice we are updating the loop condition, but this is not going to cause that condition to evaluate to false at any point. Why? Because the condition is while the number is less than or equal to 10. We started with 10, we printed 10, and then we decremented that value to 9. 9 is less than or equal to 10. We keep decrementing and there is no stop. So we started with the negative values. So minus 10 is also less than or equal to 10. So at no point my number will be greater than or equal to 10 because we are starting with 10 and we are decrementing the value. So if I wanted to stop at 0, instead of having that condition, while my number is greater than or equal to 0, I will be printing the value. And this way we are starting with 10 and we'll be stopping at 0. So if we save this and run it, it should produce the correct output. So we are printing from 10 and we are there terminating at 0.